Hello. Thank you for joining me today for our Mystery Ancestor live stream. I haven't tried something like this before, so I hope that it all goes well. Let me just give you some background on who I am, since many of you don't know me yet. My name is Jenny Ann Nielsen, and I am a professional genealogist, and also I am the owner of the ldsgenealogy.com website. I have been running that site for about 16 years now, and sometimes there's confusion where people think that I'm Family Search. I'm not. I just own a private website that's just owned by me. And today I'm going to be answering people's questions about their mystery ancestor. I have been helping people for many years to be able to figure out how to find their ancestors. I do this for Family Search. Currently as a volunteer and in my local Family Search Center, and help people around me as well. And I am excited to try doing this in a video format. And my hope is that as I talk about some of these mystery ancestors that people have submitted to me ahead of time, that some of the strategies that I'm using will apply to you and your own ancestor that you're having trouble finding. One of my favorite things to do is to look at these types of ancestors that we get stuck on. So without any further ado, then I am going to go ahead and start the first ancestor here. Just give me a moment to share my screen. Okay, so we are going to look here at Richard Henry Belcher. Deborah requested that we look at him. And she was able to find census records for Richard later on in 1900 and in 1910. She was able to locate a marriage record for him. There's not a death record because they were just beginning to record deaths in Virginia at this time, and there wasn't one made for him, unfortunately. But she was not able to find him in the 1870 or 1880 census records with parents. And she says, the first record I can find is his marriage record in 1889. The only hope of finding his parents would be to find him in the 1870 or 1880 census, but I'm unsure if he's born in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, or Petersburg. Part of Dinwiddie became part of Petersburg. So I looked on Wikipedia on this one to understand the time and place. And it looks like the city of Petersburg, where the couple were married, was separated from Dinwiddie County in 1871. Before 1871, it was Dinwiddie County. So since he's born in 1862, he would have been born in Dinwiddie County, and my guess is probably the portion of Dinwiddie County that later became the city of Petersburg. So in thinking on him and the early census records, there's a lot of possible reasons why someone may not be showing up with parents. I think as genealogists, we tend to think that always there's going to be father, mother, children in the household, and that's the typical thing that usually happens. But sometimes there's an unusual circumstance that occurs, like say one of the parents dies when the child is young. And so then the child goes and lives with grandparents or other relatives. Or I've seen cases where a woman's husband dies and she remarries and then takes on a different surname, and her children from the first marriage are listed with a different surname because they're listed with the surname of the second husband. So there's a lot of potential reasons why he can't be found in the census under his name, Richard Belcher, right at this time. But fortunately, in this case, we have a really awesome source, which is his marriage record from 1889, and it has quite a few details about him. So I'm going to pull that up right here and show you this image. So there was some confusion too, because this marriage record was indexed a couple of different ways, whether what the father's name is on this record. So I always love to go to the original document that the index came from. So you can see here, it says Richard Belcher married to Nanny. This is his wife. These are the ages, 26 and 21. They're both single. And there's this great column. If I go to the top, I can see what these columns mean. Places of their birth. This is awesome because the individuals themselves, when they married, he said he's born in Dinwiddie County, which is really helpful to us, and she was as well. And it says they're living in Petersburg. This doe here means same as above, like ditto. These quotation marks mean same as above as well. And then we have the names of the parents. Now it says Kate and Lucy. And I thought, now that's interesting because Kate is normally what we think of as a woman's name. But then I think that, okay, the clerk is going to be writing down what he hears the person say. So if I think of the name Kate, that could be also Cade, perhaps. And so that was my thought, is maybe this really means the name Cade and not Kate. So Cade would be a man's name, and that would make more sense to me. So then I got to thinking, okay, if he says that his parents are Cade and Lucy Belcher, is there a marriage record in Dinwiddie County between someone named Belcher and a Lucy? So I took a dive into those records, and interestingly enough, I found a marriage record of a Belcher man to a Lucy. And as you can see, let me see if I can zoom in here a little bit so you can see it. Cade Belcher. I don't know if you say his name Cade, probably Cade. I don't know. Here he is, single. He's born in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, and he's married in 1861, the year before Richard is born, and he's marrying Lucy Ann Traylor. Now, I didn't see any other Belchers to Lucy's, Belcher men, but the name Cade sure seems to fit the marriage record of Richard. So I thought, well, these potentially could be our two parents for him. But I wanted a little bit more information. So I looked up Cade in the 1870 census. I found him there, but the details are a little bit different than what you would expect. Again, sometimes we have a family coming out a little different than what we might think. Here's Cade Belcher right here, age 30. The age fits, the place fits, it's in Dinwiddie County. And it has a wife, Liza A., which doesn't really fit the name Lucy. And there's this boy named Nat that's listed as 9 years old. That's the same age as our Richard. And I thought, sometimes the census enumerator puts somebody's name incorrectly. They were being paid to go down the street and talk to anybody, and they got paid by how many people they enumerated. So they talked to whoever they found at home, whether child, wife, parent, next door neighbor. Sometimes information can be a little bit off, or they misheard something. So they write down what they hear. So potentially this could be Nat. I looked to see, has anybody identified Nat in later census records? Does he appear later? And he doesn't. And it doesn't look like anyone's identified who this Nat person is. So I thought possibly this is our Richard, as the age and father seem to fit. And then there's this big gap in the years of the children. There's 9-year-old Nat and there's 11/12 David. And then there's this Mingy Inda here listed age 6, a little girl. So I thought, that's interesting. What's she doing in the household? Well, turns out, short time later, there is a marriage of Cade again, still in Dinwiddie County. And here he is marrying Cade Belcher, and he's marrying an Eliza Mengia. Notice that's the same surname as that little girl. So I believe Eliza was married before, had that little girl. Cade's married before. So this is a second marriage for both of them. And I know it's the same man because the parents listed are the same. And again, and we're here in Petersburg. Okay. So it looks to me like the father or the mother of Richard died when he was small. Or I guess there could even have been a divorce situation. And then Cade Belcher marries somebody else. And I don't know where he is in 1880. I didn't see that. But here's a few ideas how we could find some more, because I don't think this is enough evidence to say for sure that these are the parents. I would like another little piece to know for certain. So I note that I did find on Ancestry.com, there is an obituary index for Richard Belcher. This matches up the date, so I assume this is him. You can click on this link and order what the obituary says. I would definitely see what that says. And then I would also look for connections for Cade. I would build out Cade's family and then see if we can find a record from Cade back to Richard. So sometimes we can find records if we look just for our person, but sometimes records for the potential family members, because sometimes there's a record for one of them that points us back to our person. So I would look for a probate record for Cade after his death to see if he left a will that names his children, or if there's a distribution, if he died intestate without a will and there was a distribution of his assets among his heirs and Richard's listed there, that would tell us. The other thing you could do is build out each of the siblings, the children of Cade, the potential siblings of Richard, and find obituaries for them, and then say, do any of them have obituaries where it names their living siblings? Often the obituaries will say they're survived by these children and these particular siblings that are living here. And if one of them said they have a brother Richard Henry, that would be very helpful to us to know for sure. So there are a number of digitized newspapers on newspapers.com, but I note that the Library of Virginia also has some additional ones that aren't on newspapers.com for this area. And these could be searched as well for obituaries for some of these Belcher individuals to see what connections could be made between them. So I will be putting all of the links in the chat here for people to see this, and feel free to ask questions. So this is Richard Belcher. Okay, next we're going to look at Matthew Sapp. Tamara requested that we look at him, and she said in her request, I've been unable to verify the parents of Matthew Sapp. I believe many of the online trees incorrectly show his parents as John M. and Louisa of Boone County, Missouri. Now, first of all, I agree completely with her that those parents don't seem to fit. For one thing, they're married 3 years after Matthew's born, and for another, they don't live in the same counties or the same area that Matthew does. So it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me that those are Matthew's parents. So then I took a look and I said, okay, what sources do we have on Matthew so far? She's got him in the 1850 census and in the 1860 census. And then there's some Civil War records. This is the one that jumped out at me, Civil War pension file, and I gave a big cheer because this document right here means that there is a big fat Civil War pension at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. that can be ordered. So what happened is the government opened up pensions for Civil War soldiers, and the soldier himself could file for a pension, or his widow, or minor children. So in this case, you can see that the widow, this is the application number, this is the number the National Archive uses to say what folder that's in. She filed in 1868, and then the minors filed here in 1891, likely after the widow died, and they received a pension for a time. They were filing from the state of Illinois. So when they filed these, they would send up a whole bunch of information about the soldier. It would give information about where the soldier enlisted and who he served with and where they were fighting. If he went to a prison camp at some point, it would say that, what injuries he sustained. There's usually a doctor letter in there where it gives like a physical description for the individual, which is really interesting and fun, how tall they were, and it will say just various information about the injuries and how that person's doing and what happened. If a wife files, a widow files, then she will have to send in information about the marriage to her husband. So there'll be a marriage document there, or there'll be an affidavit of somebody who was at the wedding, which can help identify the family. And then there's usually several affidavits of people who've known this person, and they will say, I am so and so, and I'm living in such and such a place, and I know that Matthew Sapp was a soldier and that he served here because I served with him, or because I've known him for 40 years and everybody in the neighborhood knows that that's what he did. And it will sometimes, even I've seen pages of family Bibles that appear in these where parents are named, or maybe the brother does an affidavit if you're really lucky, and it will say I'm his brother, or there's other details. More often, it doesn't state his parents directly, but it will give who the neighbors were, where he grew up. So it'll say, I'm so-and-so, and I live in such and such a place. And so that can be really helpful, because then, and I've known him for all these years. So then you can go and say, okay, now where does that person live? And which Sapp families are living nearby? And that can help you identify a family for this individual. So these Civil War pension files are really a lot of fun. They can be anywhere between 50, I've even seen as many as 250 pages worth of documents for a person in these files. And in this case, there's actually two different ones. There's a widow one and there's a minor. If the person themselves, then they'd be under invalid, then there would be an application number here for him. He didn't file while he was living, but his widow and minors did. So that would be my first step, as I obtain that. The other thing I saw in the sources was that Matthew Sapp obtained a land patent. So this means that he was one of the original settlers in Pike County, Illinois. Well, usually when people go to a new location, they don't go by themselves because they're going out in the middle of nowhere where things aren't settled. So family groups tended to go together, because then if things go sour and your farm doesn't work out, you're not going to starve because you've got family and friends there to lean on and to help and support one another. Oh, sorry, I need to go back and mention that Civil War pension files, there's an article on my site. I will put that in the chat. And there's also a place called Gopher Records that you can either order the pension file from the National Archives themselves, or I know a company that does a really good job where you could order that as well. Okay, moving back to the land documents. So I was really curious when I saw this patent. Did Matthew Sapp have other people that also went, that his relatives that went at the same time that he did to Pike County, Illinois? Because if so, we could find some connections there. So the land patents are on the Ancestry.com site, but they are also on another site. Whoops, that's not the link. Give me just a moment. Here, the Bureau of Land Management. So you can look up on their site. So I can say Illinois has all the different patents for all the different states here if they were the first settlers. And I can say I want to get Pike County and I want to get any Sapps that were there, and I'm going to search. So we can see here is Matthew right here. Let's see if I can increase this a little bit. I think we're okay. We can see here's Matthew. Note that he is in township number 7, range 5, and section 10. Look who else is at 7, 5, and 10. Daniel D. Sapp. Here's somebody that's buying a property right next to Daniel's. In addition, we have William Sapp, who's in 7, 5, and section 11. So he's in the section right next to it. There's 10 and 11 right next to each other. And so William Sapp also purchases land, and they all get it in the same year, 1849. So my guess is that Daniel D. and William and Matthew are all likely related to each other. They could be brothers. One could be a father. They could be first cousins. Don't really know their connection yet, but it would be worth digging into the records and see if we can find connections between these individuals, because these are the likely family members. And then there's also James and John. They're living a little bit further away, though. They're not, I'd have to look at the map of the townships to see precisely. They're coming at a little bit different time, so they may or may not be related, but they might be, because they're still living in the same county, not too far away. So worth it finding them. So then the question becomes, well, what documents should I look at? Now, in Missouri and Illinois, where Matthew Sapp is living, there are not birth records, marriage records. Well, there are some marriages, but they're not detailed. There's not death records yet that are going to name them. You might not find a magical document that says Matthew's father was X, but there's a good chance that if you dig into some of the records for the area, that you can find connections between him and other people with the surname Sapp, where you could come up with a good indirect evidence of who his family members were. So to find the records for this area, there's a couple ways you can do that. One is to use the directory on my website. This is the directory of records, where I've taken 1,700 websites or so and gathered all the ones for a specific place in one place. So it saves you a few steps. So you come to Illinois, and then I can find Pike County, and then you could dig into the different types of records that exist for this area. I would focus in particularly on the probate records and the land records, because those are the ones most likely to give connections. You can see there's not really birth records until later on, 1877. So there's not going to be birth records. Tax wouldn't hurt either, because it says who people are and who's living next to each other. So it can give you some good evidence putting things together. The other place that you can look to find the records for this area is to look at the Family Search catalog. The Family Search has a lot of records. A lot of people are familiar with coming at the top and saying search and then records and searching by name. But the catalog, which is obtained from search and then catalog from Family Search, you can look up just a specific place and find all the records that Family Search has, both unindexed and indexed, where if you do just a general search, you're just going to get the ones where you can search by name. They have many, many records that still they're digitized and you can view them, but they're not indexed, where you can type a name and it will pull up all of them. At least not yet. They're working on it. So you could, for example, come to the land and probate records and pick the deeds. And you can see all these different, all of these are a different microfilm that they took probably years ago, and then they digitized them. So you can see that we can just view this, click on this little camera image and view, and I can go through the different documents and go through the different, there's 806 images on this film. Usually there's an index at the beginning where it will say, okay, for this person, their record is on page such and such. So you can go through these and see what records that you can find about these various SAP men that are in Pike County. I would also look at Lincoln County, Missouri, where he was originally, and pull all the files that you can on this family. There is an article on my site that gives an overview of using the Family Search Catalog. And at the bottom, it's got a link to a couple of YouTube videos that give you in-depth explanation on using the Family Search Catalog if you get confused. I don't think it's super intuitive. A lot of people get confused trying to use it. So they'll show you how you use the information from this. So I would recommend that you study the SAP men, the ones that I identify that are living next door to him, as well as any others in the area, and see what connections you can make between them that will help point you to Matthew Sapp's family. I think there's a good chance that you will be able to come up with who it was. So that is Matthew Sapp. Okay, so I just wanted to just open it up if anyone had any questions on these two that I have done so far, or any other questions that you want to ask. I'm just going to give a minute here and make sure I didn't miss anything here in the comments. Hopefully my links are coming through that I'm putting in there. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and move on to the next one. Give me just a minute here. Isabella Bennett is our next person. Give me just one moment to share my screen here. Oop. Okay, next we're going to look at Isabella Bennett. Valerie requested that we look at her ancestor, Isabel. So I looked at what sources does she have for her. Well, she's got her in the various census records up to her death. And interestingly enough, some of these census records say she's born in Georgia, and some of them say she's born in South Carolina. So that makes it a little tricky. Where did she really come from? One asks. Well, thankfully, we have this wonderful U.S. Confederate pension application. This is a great document because she herself was filing for a pension for her husband. So there were pensions for the Civil War on the Union side. There were more of them, but also the Confederate states also provided pensions, usually a little bit later in time, for people who suffered because of the war, and the widows and children of these men, sometimes the men themselves, due to issues with the war. So Isabella herself filed with the government. So this is going to be more accurate what she's going to state here than what a census could be, because really what the census is, it depends on who talked to the census taker and what did they say and how did the census taker hear it. So there's variant spellings, there's variant ages. Sometimes the state someone's born in may change. Various information will be different. But this is a statement that Isabella is sending into the government, and so it's more likely to be correct. And we know Isabella herself is giving this information. So it asks these wonderful questions. What is your name and where do you reside? Isabella Van Diver, Jamesville, Hall County, Georgia. How long and since when have you been a resident of this state? Since her birth, 1834. When and where were you born? October 23rd, 1834, Hall County, Georgia. This is great. And then it gives her marriage information to James D. Van Diver in 1854. So this is wonderful because Isabella herself said she was born in Hall County, Georgia. So Valerie also obtained a marriage record for them. Unfortunately, when you look at the image for this thing, it's like a lot of typical early marriage records where it just says James D. Van Diver and Isabella Bennett were married on such and such a day. And doesn't give any other information. Oh, how we wish it did. Why couldn't they have put in parents? But they didn't. It just gives just the dates and where the marriage occurred, and that's it. Doesn't give a lot of detail. But we do know that she was born in Hall County, Georgia. So that gives us an opportunity to dig into records for that area. Now, there are not any death records because they weren't recording them in Georgia in 1906, but there is a good chance that in 1906 there would be an obituary record for Isabella. So I would see if there's an obituary for her. So now one way that's easy to find it is, again, to come to my website, and we can come to Georgia and we can pull up Hall County, and we can come to the newspapers. And I've gone through all the about 1,000 different websites that have digitized newspapers on them and put it all in one place so you can see at a glance which ones have the newspapers for where and what years do they cover. So it looks like there are actually not any on newspapers.com, so you're not going to find them there. A lot of times we think, oh, if we're looking for newspapers, I looked on newspapers.com, so there's no obituary. Well, that's not the case. Though they're the biggest site, they have a lot of newspapers. There's a lot of other sites too that have them. A couple of these are actually free ones: the Georgia Historic Newspapers, the Azilia Regional Library System, and then there's even a couple of books where people took extracts from the newspapers in this area and put them in books. So when you click on this link, it'll give you the information of how to find that in WorldCat, which is a big library catalog. So it's a hard copy book that's sitting in a library, and you could potentially see which library it's in. If there's one near you, you could go and look it up, or call the library. Usually the smaller ones are better. Call them up and say, hey, I can see that you've got this book on the shelf. Will you go and look and find these names for me and give me copies of any pages that you find about my ancestor? So you could see if you could find something about her in these extracts from the papers, as well as search through any digital newspapers they have for the area. So in this case, because she's a woman and there's not going to be a lot of records about her, you're going to need to look at records of her husband and other men in her life. Now, there might not be a magic document that says Isabella's father was X, but there's a good chance that you can find clues as to who her family was by the documents of her husband. Who is signing the deeds? Who are the witnesses? Who's living next door? Information like that with her surname. You're going to use what's called a cluster research strategy. I have an article about this on my website that gives examples of what I'm talking about, and then there's some different case studies here to explain it. So really what we're going to do with Isabella, she's born in 1834, and she's not going to be on that. Let me pull up Isabella's page here again. She's born in 1834, and she's not going to be listed in the 1840 census because only the head of households are listed in 1840. But there are going to be, her father is likely going to be listed in that 1840 census. So what you can do is you can look for Bennett men in the 1840 census who have daughters that are young. And then you can identify who those potential fathers might be, and then pull together records and build out trees and try to figure out which one does Isabella fit into in these different families that you're looking at. And you may be able to find evidence as you build. You may have to build some trees of the different Bennett families in Hall County, Georgia, and try to connect people to figure out which of these family groups does Isabella fit into. And if you look at enough records, there's a very good chance that you'll be able to identify where Isabella fits. And you'll likely find a bunch of her other family members at the same time, because a lot of times when we find one person, in order to find them in a strategy like this, when you're looking at all the different people, you're going to be able to put together probably several families and who her siblings were, and maybe even past that. I would also recommend that you do a deep dive in the family search catalog, like I talked about before, into the Hall County records, where we can come here and we can say Hall, Georgia, and we can look at things like the court records, the guardianship records, the land and property records, the probates, the tax lists, etc. Anything that gives us information about this place. It looks like there's even some old histories where it talks about some of the, there's likely talks about some of the families in the area. The history, the families of Hall County, where you could use some of those resources to connect together where she may fit into these families. So you're just going to dig in as much as you can and look at the records specifically narrowed down for Hall County, Georgia. So I think there still are plenty of places to look for Isabella, and there's a very good chance that you could find more on her. And so that is Isabella. Okay, now we're going to look at Amantha Martha Jordan. This was requested by Diane to look at her. Now, Amantha is a little bit of a difficult situation. For one thing, she's born in Vermont, and there's a lot of early Vermont and New Hampshire. There was a lot of changes in boundary lines over time, and between Vermont, New Hampshire, New York. In addition, in Vermont, this applies to Connecticut and Massachusetts as well, and Maine, the New England states. They were recording births, marriages, and deaths early on, but the records aren't necessarily comprehensive. And so there'll be whole families or some people who will be missing from the vital records that do exist. So that makes it a little bit trickier. It looks like there's not a marriage record that's been located for Amantha Jordan to her husband, Bethuel, and so far we basically just have a census record for her in Illinois, and then one where she's in Iowa, and then we have a cemetery record in the Salt Lake City Cemetery where she dies. It looks like the family moved from Vermont to Illinois between 1841 and 1843, because this one son here, Bethuel, is born in 1841, and Margaret is born in Illinois. Sorry, he's born in 1841 in Vermont, and then the daughter Margaret is born in Illinois. So the family clearly moved in that period of time. Her husband's family's been tracked, and they were from Washington County, Vermont, it looks like, and then some of them moved to McDonough County, Illinois. But when I look at the census for her husband, he's not a landowner, and so that can make it a little trickier because we can't use deeds and probates very well for him. And I'm not seeing that there are any Jordan families living in the area nearby, at least in Illinois, where they were living. So she may have relatives that were living there in Illinois, but they don't have her same surname. They're not using the name Jordan, but she could have, say, a sister that lives nearby, but she's married a man with a different surname, and so they have different surnames than she is. So there's not something obvious that's jumping out as people. We only know her maiden name Jordan because some of the records of the children name her maiden name as that. So the tricky thing with Vermont as well is that the records are kept at a town level rather than a county level. In the Salt Lake City Cemetery record, it says she's born in Cheshire, Vermont, but there is no Cheshire, Vermont. There is a Cheshire County, New Hampshire, which is on the eastern border of Vermont. So it could be referring to Cheshire County, perhaps, but you would have to look at records for every single town in Cheshire County. Because it's in every individual town the records are kept. You can't look at a county level for the records. So that makes it a little bit more complex to do this one. But we do know where her husband's family lives. So, and who his parents were and where they were living. So the suggestions that I would have on this one, first of all, according to Diane, she joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints before her death, and that would fit her dying in Salt Lake County, Utah. So the first thing I would do is see if she ever received a patriarchal blessing. So that can be ordered through the churchofjesuschrist.org website. You can log into your account if you're a descendant and request a patriarchal blessing for your ancestor. If she did receive one, when they gave those blessings, then typically the date, place of birth was listed, date of birth, and also names of parents. So that would be really helpful if she received one. That would help us narrow down who her family is a lot better. So that would be my first suggestion. The second suggestion that I have is to look at where the Miller family is living, and then look at Jordan families that are living nearby, because likely she would be living in the area where her husband was living. Back in that day, they're not traveling large distances. You're going as fast as you can by walking and with a horse. So people tended to marry people who were living near them, not far away distances. So I would look at where Bethuel Miller's family is living, and are there Jordan families nearby, and look for records for them. And you would need to be looking in the town records that they have. Hopefully the towns that they were in don't have too much record loss. There's quite a few towns in Vermont where the records are a bit sparse. There was a number of them where early records were lost in courthouse fires and that type of thing. So you're going to do a cluster type of research strategy where you're going to look at people in the neighborhood of where the husband is. I have a couple of case studies that I put on my website that would use a similar strategy, so you understand a little bit better what I'm talking about, and I will put those in the chat. And then I would recommend an excellent book, and this is a great book for anybody to read for any situation. It's called The Family Tree Problem Solver, Tried and True Tactics for Tracing Elusive Ancestors, written by Marcia Hoffman Rising. She was an excellent genealogist and passed a few years ago. This book's been through 3 editions, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book. She gives a lot of examples of being able to navigate early U.S. records, looking at neighbors, doing cluster type strategies, fan strategies, and putting people together and she focuses in on really tough research situations. And this one, honestly, is going to be a tough one to find because we know so little. Diane did mention that there's multiple descendants that have done DNA, but we're a little bit distant to be able to do much with DNA on this one because she is pretty far back in time. So if we use DNA tests like Ancestry.com, the autosomal tests, you usually can really use it reliably within 4 or 5 generations. And she's in 1811. And so there's probably not many descendants that go back that far. So once you go past a certain phase, you may share DNA with people, but there's such small segments that it's difficult to ascertain precisely how they are related. So the DNA results are usually going to be more useful within 4 or 5 generations of the person testing. So DNA may not help a whole lot here. There is mtDNA, which does the mother's line. If you followed her through a daughter line and then took it to the present, if that's possible to do, that might help. But even the mitochondrial DNA test is a little tricky to use because it doesn't tell you, it'll tell you here's people who match you in your maternal line and it goes back many generations, but it doesn't work as well as, say, the Y-DNA for the men, where it's easier to tell how many generations distant is it, and plus the surnames are in common, where with the women, the surnames change with every generation. So it might be helpful, but you'd have to have a theory probably in mind for the mtDNA, the mother's DNA, to help on this one. You need to have a possible Jordan family where she fits, and then see if you match on the mitochondrial DNA, the mtDNA on that. So that is my thoughts on Amantha. Hopefully there's something in there that might be useful on this one. Okay, so that is the 4 ancestors that I was going to look at specifically today. If there are any questions, I'll just give anyone a few minutes here if you wanted to ask any questions on anything. I did see a comment from Sherry. She's asking, she doesn't give a lot of detail, but she says there's a death of a man, Edward Crutcher. Theory is Alexander Crutcher is his father. They're in Tennessee. So just offhand, without seeing where, the details that she has on him, I would look and see if there's an obituary for Edward Crutcher that says something about where he came from, any living siblings. And I would also look at land and probate records for the potential father. There may be a probate for Alexander Crutcher, the father, where heirs are named. If someone dies without a will, then there may be another probate record where heirs will be listed. Hopefully you're lucky and there's a record there for that. Or sometimes after the father dies or both parents die, the heirs, the children, all split the land and they're all named as a group. And so if after Alexander Crutcher dies, there may be a land record that you could look at where heirs are listed there. So just offhand, that would be the first couple of places that I would look on that particular one, just with that sparse info that I have there. And Mary, I agree. It's a great book, The Family Tree Problem Solver. It's really an excellent one. If you want to just look at your research in a different way than you have before, it just has a lot of excellent examples in it of how Martha Hoffman Rising took really difficult, complex situations and was able to find a family for someone. We have Shirley, difficult time researching my great-grandfather who was born into slavery in 1852, one as a boy with Union Army after the Civil War. Yes, African Americans can be particularly difficult because they don't tend to show up in the early records very much. You're mentioning that he was in the Union Army. I don't know, there may be a Civil War pension for him. I would look for that. I would look on fold 3, see if there's a card. They do have the Civil War pension files on Ancestry.com as well. But yes, there, I put a link in there about Civil War pension files. I would look and see if I can find them there. It's important to keep in mind with African Americans too, that sometimes they would change their surname. So when they were in slavery, they didn't have a surname that was assigned to them. So they could just kind of choose a surname. So sometimes they'd choose a surname of their slave owner. Sometimes they'd choose the slave owner they liked best because they'd been owned by multiple people. Sometimes they just picked a surname they liked. Sometimes even siblings pick different surnames. So it can be tricky. So it's possible that maybe he changed his surname at one point. And so you're not finding him in earlier records because he's listed under a different name. Another thing to keep in mind that he's probably a less educated man as well, and they didn't tend to know their age. So you might go broader on the census on his birth year and go plus or minus 5 or 7 years, because he might have a bigger range of birth dates than you're thinking. I've seen the same thing with like Scottish and Irish, or yeah. Sometimes people just didn't know. They're listed with ages really broadly on the census. If you know anything about your great-grandfather's family members at all, definitely look for all records that you can find with anyone connected to him. Sometimes looking for a neighbor that has a surname that he's using as well, those might be potential relatives, and you might have to research them and link back to him. So just a couple of strategies that come to mind offhand. It's always better if I can look at the whole tree, but those are some of the strategies I would think of. Okay. If there's nothing else, I'm just going to give it here just another minute or two, and then I'm just going to go ahead and close this. I am going to be posting this to our Facebook page and to our YouTube channel when this ends, so that anyone who would like to can review it. And I will hopefully be doing this again, and you are welcome to put in the chat there your own mystery ancestor. I'd want to have, if you want me to look at them specifically, I'd want to link to your tree, what you're trying to find out, and information on anything else that you don't know, or any other documents or information that you have about that person that's not specifically in your tree. Once in a while people have a tree, but they have some other documents that they haven't put in the tree. So I'd want to know about anything else that you know. So I'm glad that you found this helpful, and I appreciate that you came and joined me today. And I wish you the best in your research. Never give up. There's always some others that we can find. So good luck to you. Goodbye.